anything manufactured in China which has cellular modules in it and is connected to the internet can ultimately be controlled from Beijing in a crisis. Now, obviously, I'm not saying this is a concern on a day-to-day basis, but what I'm saying is that we're putting more and more of our critical infrastructure, and energy lies at the center of it, into the hands of the Chinese.
Hi, Richard. Thank you very much for coming on. Analysis by the Times has found that Chinese businesses have funded or provided parts for at least 14 of the 50 British offshore wind farm projects currently in operation or late in development. You've said you find this concerning. Why? Do we have a particular reason to believe that this is happening?
Well, we've been around this circuit before with Huawei and 5G, and there is a concern, I think, that anything manufactured in China which has cellular modules in it and is connected to the internet can ultimately be controlled from Beijing in a crisis. Now, obviously, I'm not saying this is a concern on a day-to-day basis, but what I'm saying is that we're putting more and more of our critical infrastructure, and energy lies at the center of it, into the hands of the Chinese. So you've got a double problem here. You've got a policy which is building overdependence on renewables, and you are building overdependence on Chinese green technology, where they dominate the market.
Do we have a particular reason to believe that this is happening? Huawei was mobile technology. A lot of what we're talking about here is generators and permanent magnets. Do we have any evidence that this is actually being sabotaged by the Chinese?
No, we don't have any evidence. I'm making an assumption. But if you look at Chinese electric vehicles, this issue's come up very clearly already. And, the cellular modules in Chinese electric vehicles could be reprogrammed, in a crisis. You could have a situation in London where you were mobilized 100 electric vehicles and, bring London traffic to a complete grinding halt. Look, all I'm saying is that we're building critical infrastructure totally dependent on the Chinese. At the same time, you've got the head of MI5 saying in past press conferences, which nation is the greatest threat to our national security? China. You've had the heads of CIA and my former service, MI6, saying the same thing in public press conferences. But at the same time, we're quite happy to put really critical bits of infrastructure into a position where they could be prejudiced by China at some point in the future. I mean, we all understand that you could have a global crisis over Taiwan. Okay, at the moment, who is sustaining a lot of Russian effort in Ukraine? China.
So is your concern that we end up having some sort of clash with the Chinese and suddenly we discover that our energy system is controlled by China?
Bits of it are controlled by China, and they can put it out of action, as a sort of punishment for whatever our policies are at the time. I just think it's extraordinary. And I think building overdependence on renewables also is short-sighted. You're creating a disordered energy system which will not meet our power needs looking ahead. I'm not saying don't invest in renewables, but, I am strongly of the view that we should be looking at nuclear power and gas as our transfer fuels, with renewables playing a role. But, when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, the system doesn't work. And look what's happened in the last few weeks. We've had to buy in huge amounts of gas to support our energy system at a very, very high price, because, when things are not functioning on the renewable side, you have to pay the highest market prices in the world.
There's a separate issue here as well. It's been estimated, I think, that about 40% of solar panels in Britain are produced by Chinese companies, linked in that case to forced labour by Uyghur Muslims. This led the Tories to abandon part of an £800 million project, but Labour seems to be going ahead with using these. Is that a separate concern? And does it show that we're just going ahead with net zero irrespective?
Yeah, we have a net zero policy, which is not driven by science, it's driven by ideology. It has all sorts of implications. And that is another aspect. We're endorsing bits of the Chinese economy which depend on forced labor. Look, there are many, many problems and aspects. I'm not saying don't trade with China. I'm saying be very careful how you trade with China and in which bits of the economy you allow them a dominant or an influential position. And I think we've just got to be much more cautious, much more careful, and much more forensic in how we work this out. Look, we started off with Huawei saying yes, and this goes way back to the time that BT signed its original contracts with Huawei. And then we very nearly put the whole of our 5G in the hands of a company which is very much under the control of the Chinese military. And we're doing it again now. It just seems to me extraordinary.
Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, has said that he's trying to achieve the government's aim for 95% clean power by 2030. Would you suggest he abandons or goes slower or finds a different way?
Look, we all want to get to somewhere close to net zero. I mean, net zero is a perfect state, so it's anomalous. We'll never get there. But on the other hand, we should be following a much more critically assessed path. We should be using up our own gas resources as a transfer fuel. We should be investing in nuclear. I'm afraid it's unachievable by 2030, and it's just going to get us into a catastrophic situation. I'm pretty sure in my own mind that this will all be abandoned. Quite apart from the fact that if you look at the issue of renewables, they violate most of the laws of thermodynamics, which Ed Miliband certainly doesn't seem to understand.